So see, these are some of the roles that you might see advertised in AI policy. They have different titles, but they do a lot of the same things. Some examples, AI policy advisor, responsible innovation, AI governance researcher, human rights and AI specialist, AI ethics and governance manager. These are some of the titles, and but a lot of the skills required to complete these, to take on these roles, are common or shared across these titles. And practically speaking, these are the skills, these are the duties that you would have in these roles. You would be required to interpret regulation, like the EU AI Act. You'd be required to conduct AI risk and impact assessments. You'll be required to translate technical claims into policy language, design internal governance processes, engage regulators, civil society, and affected communities. And these are some of the frameworks and concepts that will enable you to delve more deeply into regulation. Because as academics, we, of course, have a lot of interesting ideas and ways of knowing, which make what we have to contribute a lot more impactful. So these are some of the frameworks that I wanted to emphasize. So there's obviously a lot that can be said about institutions and what are institutions, what makes an institution long-lasting, what preserves the norms, how do norms come about, how do you become familiar with those, and how do you leverage those norms in order to be effective at your job. There's a lot on knowledge and power, who holds power, how do you share power equitably. There's a lot on evidence and expertise, and how you assess expertise. There are different people there are different kinds of experts. You can have the more scientific, and you can have the more public-facing experts. Who do you rely upon when you're trying to make important decisions? And my speciality, where my research falls into, is on decoloniality and epistemic injustice, which I will talk about in quite a bit of detail, because I feel like it's not discussed enough, but it has so much importance and value to the conversation around AI policy. Briefly, epistemic injustice and decolonial AI is about the systematic devaluing, exclusion, or misinterpretation of certain knowers and ways of knowing, often along racial, geographic, or colonial lines within knowledge-producing systems, including AI. And my research looks at how do we not privilege just Western-centric frameworks, but how do we be more inclusive of other epistemologies, ways of knowing, knowledge frameworks found in the global South, like Ubuntu, which is a South African philosophy. I've been doing a lot of research on that because I'm doing a part-time master's, again at UCL, which is where I did my undergrad. And I've applied to do a PhD, so this is something I'm very passionate about. And I'm also implementing it in my own business, so doing decoloniality impact assessments for AI, so that businesses become more conscious of where they're extracting data from, how they compensate people they've extracted data from. It's a very different paradigm to just the colonial ways of doing things, where you go to a place in the global South, you do a study, you extract data, you might say, thanks for the data, but then all of the credit goes to you as the person who produces a textbook or research. It's a very different way of doing research and setting up income streams for your company. Another really important framework that I want to develop on is the multiple streams framework. You might have come across this because it is quite, it's mentioned in quite a few policy modules. It's essentially a policy theory that explains political change, as occurring when problem, policy, and politics streams align, during windows of opportunity. So this can be an election or a natural disaster, often through the actions of policy entrepreneurs. So that's just people like parliamentarians or policymakers or think tanks who influence policy. There are some other concepts that I wanted to talk about which are relevant specifically to responsible innovation, which you would only really be exposed to if you did a module in responsible innovation, science and innovation. And there's a concept around tech solutionism. And this is the idea that complex social and political problems can be solved primarily through technical fixes, often bypassing democratic deliberation and structural reform. Now, there's a lot of pitfalls. There are lots of pitfalls with this approach to policy or, addressing social problems, because social problems are so complex and they require the perspectives of different stakeholders, not just technologists. And you'll find that a lot of big tech companies have this tendency to think that the solution is just encryption or privacy in the technical sense, when actually, when interacting with human society, there's a lot more complexity involved. And so I would encourage you to think critically about any solution presented by a tech company that ignores the social dimension of these technologies. There's also the contrast or the dichotomy between technological determinism and social constructivism. So these are competing views on whether technology automatically shapes society, or whether social, political, and economic forces shape how technologies are designed and used. And then finally, there's the sociology of hype. We see a lot of hype in AI. Some of it is justified, some of it is just fiction. And so being able to disentangle between fact and fiction is a critical skill that's gonna ensure that you're not swept away by this speculative bubble that we find ourselves in. We find across history when new technologies come about. So yeah, think about the legitimacy of some of the claims that are made about AI.